Pierre Henneaux. So he's an associate professor at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. And he works also as an energy system planning and economics expert for Tractebel, one of the utilities in Belgium. And all of his work focuses on application of probabilistic methods, reliability studies, and so on. Yeah, so over to you, Pierre. So feel free to share your screen and yeah, give us your talk.
Thank you. Do you see my screen?
Yes, we do. Yeah, perfect.
Perfect. So thank you for the.
Oh, just lost your volume now. Okay, something happened there.
Yeah, sorry, I will just, I didn't expect that to start now.
Yeah, one thing that sometimes happens with Zoom, there's a kind of option maybe for kind of, I don't know, there's some buttons in the bottom left when you kind of do the share screen thing, it pops up with another thing and then you can click or unclick things.
Yeah, so, sorry for that. How do I?
Have another go, see what happens.
Yeah, I will maybe just save in PDF because I registered myself yesterday.
Ah, so you were going to play your own video.
And yeah, so I will do like that. Yeah, hopefully the sound apparently now is not anymore present. So thank you for your introduction. I will actually present today the results of a joint work between the Université Libre de Bruxelles and Tractebel about the impact assessment of a minimum threshold on cross-zonal capacity in a flow-based market. So before going into the specificities of this work, I would like to give you a few words of introduction about the organization of the electricity sector in Europe.
By the way, Pierre, have you got some slides to show us?
Yeah, you don't see my slides?
No, we don't at the moment.
Sorry.
It was sounding good already, though.
Now you see?
We see, yes, perfect.
Perfect.
And we can hear you as well. Carry on talking. Yes, we can hear you. Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to shut up now and let you carry on.
Perfect. So I was saying before going into the specificities of this work, I will say a few words about the organization of the electricity sector in Europe because it's quite particular and so it's important as foundation to understand this work. So we do have a fully liberalized electricity market. And so because the power system has some extent, the question that you have then is how to manage transmission constraints. So how to consider with the market transmission constraints so that you cannot transfer electricity as you want between different zones or between different regions. So we adopted in Europe, and that's the specificity somehow of Europe, a zonal system. In a zonal system, you will divide the overall power system in different zones. Each zone will group several nodes. And so within a zone, you will say to the market participant, okay, you can trade freely electricity. And if we do have congestion, so if we have overloads or voltage issue, we will manage that by redispatch. However, between the different bidding zones, you will say to the market participants, you have only a limited transfer capacity. So you need to consider that at the level of the market clearing. And so for historical and political reasons, bidding zone corresponds mainly to countries. As you can see on this slide, on this picture from an essay report, so you can see that around Belgium, Netherlands, France do constitute each time a zone. And so we will be able to transfer electricity from France to the Netherlands, for example, with a limited transfer capacity. And so when I say a limited transfer capacity, the question is how do we calculate and allocate the transmission capacity available between the different bidding zones. You have two main approaches. The first approach is called the coordinated net transfer capacity approach, the NTC approach, or sometimes the ATC for available transfer capacity. And then you will define bilateral capacities at each border. So between Belgium and France, between Belgium and the Netherlands, you will have each time a bilateral capacity. It means that you need to pre-allocate the transfer capacity between the different borders that you can have in your grid when you have a mesh configuration of bidding zones. And so for that reason, it is considered as suboptimal, although it is strongly in place because for historical reasons, we used that before the liberalization of the electricity sector around 2000. You have another approach, the flow-based approach, where you will try to represent more accurately the power flow and transmission element. So you will say basically what will limit the exchange of power between two bidding zones is actually, for instance, the thermal capacity of transmission element. So I do need at the level of the market clearing algorithm to represent that more accurately. And so you will try to be, for that, more efficient than the NTC approach, because you don't need to pre-allocate transfer capacity between borders. It was decided to be the target model for Europe by the European Commission in the Central Western Europe region, gathering Belgium, France, Netherlands, Germany, and Austria. It's in use since 2015, but it is more complex, and it is the purpose of this paper to analyze and to simulate such a model. To give you an intuitive comparison of NTC and flow-based approach, if you consider that the power flow on transmission elements are a linear combination of the power flow of the power exchanges between zones. So you have, for example, here the zone A, B, and C. So you can say, okay, the power flow on the transmission element is a linear combination of the power flow between A and B and the power flow between A and C. And so you will say, I have a thermal limit, and so you will have some linear constraints constraining the exchanges that you can have in your grid. Because for an NTC approach, in red, you will need to pre-allocate, you will need to define bilateral transfer capacity independently. You will need to pre-allocate the transfer capacity. And so you see that intuitively, the red box is within the blue complex shape. And you see that you give them more transmission capacity using the flow-based approach. In 2019, there was a new regulation of the European Parliament and of the Council in Europe to impose a minimum threshold of 70% of cross-zonal capacity for trade. So meaning somehow that transmission system operator needs to allocate at least 70% of their capacity, the capacity of transmission elements for cross-zonal trades. But then there was no real impact assessment. So you can wonder what will be the impact of such a threshold on the socio-economic welfare, so the total socio-economic welfare, but also the distribution between the various actors. And so this is precisely the objective of this work, is to develop a simulation framework and to test this simulation framework to address that question. So after this introduction, I will say a few additional words on flow-based market coupling, as it is in the core of this work, to give a little bit more background about that. And then a few words about the simulation framework, what we analyzed with the case study, and then the main conclusion. I will be short. You have much more details in the paper if you want to have a deep understanding of flow-based market coupling and what we simulated exactly. So a few words about flow-based market coupling. As I said, the main aim is to avoid the ex-ante allocation of transmission capacity between borders in a mesh grid that you could have with the NTC approach by really bringing within the market clearing process the physical constraints limiting cross-border power exchanges. You will need to keep the optimization problem for the market clearing process linear. So you need to rely on the DC power flow approximation, which means that you can consider the active power flows on transmission elements that should be below their thermal limits in N, but also in N-1 condition, which is very important in Europe because we do operate the grid with N-1 security rule. And but the drawback of the DC power flow approximation is that if you want to model voltage or stability issues, you will need to resort to artificial external constraints. You will not be able to model that really. And so the complexity with a zonal approach is that if you have a transmission element, the flow that you have on a transmission element is not only due to the cross-border power exchanges. So indeed, if you have a specific thermal capacity, you are not going to be able to allocate all the thermal capacity to cross-zonal exchanges. First, you will need a reliability margin because you have some uncertainty in your grid, some variability of flows. And so we need to cover that with a flow reliability margin. And then you will need to consider also that within bidding zones, you have several nodes separated by transmission elements. It's not perfectly a copper plate. So even if you don't have exchanges between the different bidding zones, if you have exchanges within bidding zones, it will create flows on every line in your grid. And so you need to book also some capacity for these internal flows. So what will remain afterwards is the remaining available margin. And so you see that what we give to the market, the parameter available to the market is not fully the thermal capacity. You need to subtract two elements, so the flow reliability margin and the FREF, so the flow due to internal exchanges. On top of that, you will need to consider N-1 security constraints. So you will not need to give all the capacity in end state, but also to include N-1 security constraints in your problem. So you have some general knowledge about the flow-based market coupling. I will describe briefly now the simulation framework. So the idea to estimate the impact of measure on the socioeconomic welfare is to actually simulate or to emulate the electricity market. And so for that, we need to estimate first the parameters that will be available for the market in the flow-based market coupling approach. And one important parameter you might have understood is the remaining available margin. And then we need to simulate the market clearing process. And then finally, but very important, we need also to simulate the redispatch, because you cannot ignore internal constraints. So we need to simulate as well the redispatch because some lines after the market clearing process might be overloaded. So first, to compute the flow-based market coupling parameter, TSO, you need a base case to estimate the FREF. And so TSO will derive what we call a D2CF, so a 2-day congestion forecast that we can emulate, it in our work by a preventive security constraint, optimal power flow, to try to find somehow the best state possible, the best generation dispatch possible. And so based on that, we can extract the flow-based market coupling parameter. And in a similar manner, to simulate the redispatch and the counter trading process, we simulated we solved a kind of preventive security constraint, optimal power flow, with a specific objective function aiming at minimizing the cost of redispatch. And we adopted two levels of cooperation between TSO. One model where we consider that we have no cooperation, so we have purely a zonal redispatch, so we redispatch within each zone individually. Or we can have also an interzonal redispatch with a full cooperation. We consider a regulatory redispatch with cost compensation for both upward and downward redispatch. A few words about the case study. So we apply that model to a 3-zone reliability test system where we modify the generation mix to introduce renewable energy sources such as wind. So you have here the numbers, and we have a little bit more than 8 gigawatts for the peak load, and we introduce almost 3 gigawatts of wind. So you have the average wind, and so you have costs, the marginal cost of generation that do reflect what we have in Europe for the moment. So you have a mix with nuclear, coal, and gas. And so when we look at the total socioeconomic welfare, we can have a look at the total annual cost of generation. What you will observe is when we have full cooperation between TSO for the redispatch, whatever happens at the level of the market, you have nevertheless a perfect redispatch afterwards with a perfect security constraint optimal power flow. So what you do in the market level doesn't change, doesn't impact that. And so without the imposition of a minimum RAM level, so a minimum amount of capacity you need to allocate to the market, or with a level of 70% as per the European Union regulation, when you have full cooperation, it doesn't change. However, you can observe that you tend to increase the annual cost of generation, so you tend to decrease the total socioeconomic welfare when you have a limited cooperation between TSO, when you impose a minimum RAM of 70%, because you have somehow artificial capacity that's given to the market, and you need to take then suboptimal redispatch action afterwards. When we look then at the split, so we can first look at the consumer payment at the market level. Obviously, it doesn't change. The redispatch model does not impact what the consumer pays at the market level because the redispatch comes afterwards. And so you can see that if you have no cooperation or full cooperation, it's approximately the same amount. It's fully the same amount. However, you can observe that when you impose a minimum RAM, you artificially increase the transfer capacity between the different building zones. So you transform your system artificially in a copper plate, and so the market prices tend to decrease, and so consumers tend to pay less at the market level. Conversely, because the market prices will decrease, the producer surplus will tend to decrease when you put a minimum RAM of 70%. However, the last component that we need to consider for the socioeconomic welfare is the congestion management costs. So you have the congestion rent at the level of the market, but then you have redispatch costs that you need to consider as well. We package here the both to simplify in a single amount. And so what you can see is obviously when you artificially increase the cross-border capacity, you will need to take more redispatch action, so the redispatch will be more costly. So someone will have to pay that redispatch. If we consider that if we put that on the consumer bill, the last table that you have there is the total annual cost of electricity for the consumer. And you can see that when you have a full cooperation between TSO, you slightly decrease the total annual cost of electricity for the consumer because they pay much less at the market level, a little bit more redispatch cost, but in fine, they pay less. However, when the redispatch is not optimal, you tend to increase what the consumer will pay. So I will conclude and I will repeat what I just said about the fact that if the redispatch is not optimally organized, you can see that a minimum threshold can increase the total generation cost. A minimum threshold can also decrease then logically the socioeconomic welfare, and it can increase the total cost of electricity for the consumer. However, if the redispatch is optimally organized, you do not impact the socioeconomic welfare because you re-optimize everything at the level at the moment of the redispatch, and you can have for this specific case study even a decrease of the total cost of electricity for the consumer. However, the model is still under development. We have to include some features to be more realistic, such that consider unit commitment that can lock some. You can lock in the market commitment of generating units, so you have less degree of freedom for the redispatch. We didn't consider uncertainty. We consider a perfect foresight, and we consider a perfect market. So there is still some room for improvement. So that concludes my presentation. Sorry for the small delay due to the technical issue.
Okay, thanks very much, Pierre. And yeah, we have a couple of questions coming on the Q&A. So Patrick Panagiotis is asking how you take into account grid flexibility. So he's saying that we have more and more phase shifting transformers that are being used, but not only that, also topological actions, so merging or splitting of substations, but also dynamic line ratings. Yeah.
The flexibility actions, I would say in a framework of an optimal power flow, if you assume that phase shifting transformer can be varied continuously, which is not true, but as a first approximation that could be good, you can integrate that quite easily in the preventive security constraint optimal power flow problem. Topological action, it's true that it's a little bit more tricky because it leads to a mixed integer linear problem. And so from a computational point of view, it's much more tricky. You need also to consider to have a detailed representation of the topology of your substation. But I would say the formalism can be easily adapted even if you then face some computational issues. Then there are indeed some interesting measures about line ratings that you can release some additional thermal capacity for your transmission element closer to real time. And so that's true that it's something I believe that we need to integrate when we speak about uncertainty, that we need to simulate different time frames. So when you have uncertainty, you cannot simulate only the day market, you need to simulate the intraday market that will act as a correction for the day market with the new information that you have. And then you might have to simulate as well the real-time balancing mechanism. I'm not sure we can call that a market, but you have that kind of mechanism. And when you have this succession of time frames, including the fact that you have less and less uncertainty when you come close to real time, then I believe in that kind of framework, you can include additional flexibility measures such as dynamic line rating. But it necessitates an extension of this work.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I guess that leads us a little bit into the other question that's been posted, which is about the cooperation between TSOs and the redispatch process. And maybe this is one of the keys is, you know, between the day ahead dispatch or the 2 day ahead, I think you mentioned as well. How good is that? How much capacity is left behind and how much is then utilized closer to real time, which then affects, you know, how much redispatch needs to go on and whether that redispatch is really optimal between the different TSOs. So in what way, you said it could be perfect or, you know, full cooperation or less than full. What does that mean if it's less than full cooperation?
Yeah, so it's true that the models here are a little bit simplified. So it's a big question for the moment in Europe when you see the redispatch costs that are increasing, that are expected also to increase with the 70% measure. Because for the moment, there is no rule really to share the redispatch cost, except close to the border. Sometimes you can have 50-50, but there are very approximate rules. And the problem when you put some rules to try to have the polluter-payer principle, to say, okay, people responsible for issues might have to pay, is that TSO can then game the system because they can have a benefit to minimize the redispatch cost and to push the cost of congestion management to the neighbors. And what we discussed just before the question of Patrick about PST and topological actions, it's discretionary TSO actions that do have an impact on the redispatch that you will need, not only on the total amount of redispatch, but potentially on who will pay for that redispatch. So I believe there are two points to address the question. Is first, from a political point of view, good rules need to be put in place to have a fair share of the redispatch costs such that the TSO are encouraged to collaborate to actually have this optimal redispatch cross-border. So that's what should happen in reality. And then at the modeling for research line and modeling line, what could be of interest could be to actually model behavior of TSO that try to optimize their own objective function and then to resort to game theory.
Yeah,
but I believe it's a huge domain for research as well.
Yeah, and incidentally, of course, us as panelists, we can't actually write on the Q&A, but we can use the chat. So I see, well, we'll quickly address this because we should be moving on to the next talk, really. But it's Bastian who's asked the next question, so he can delay his own talk. How do you explain the decrease of socioeconomic welfare when a minimum threshold of 70% is implemented? I mean, his understanding, more capacity made available to the market leads to more trades, leads to increase of social welfare.
So that's the tricky thing. It's because you increase the socioeconomic welfare when you look purely at the market level. But you give artificially that capacity to the market. And so it means that you will need, if you give artificially that capacity to the market, it means that you will have overloads afterwards.
So it kind of means that you're not withholding some margin to deal with either the internal constraints within an area or to deal with what turns out when you get closer to real time. Is that kind of part of it as well?
So it's true that you can, so in the flow reliability margin, you can say, I can release close to real time. I have a better view on my flow, so I can release that. But flow reliability margin, they tend to be 10%. So it's quite low when you are not able to allocate 70%. It's not strongly due to the flow reliability margin because it consumes only 10%. It will be more internal flows and loop flows that will consume several tenths of percent and even sometimes 50, 60, 70%. And it means that if you consume that for your internal flows, you will, it's not a margin, you will have an overload of your line. And so you need to manage that by redispatch. And if your redispatch is not optimal, you artificially gave that to the market, but then you need to compensate by suboptimal actions.
Yeah, okay.
So that's the point of this paper.
Yeah, right. Cool. All right, we better move on. But look, thanks very much, Pierre.
You're welcome.
This is the kind of thing that I could just imagine, with Patrick and Hussein, if we were really in Porto, we would be heading out to a bar and carrying on the discussion of this, which unfortunately in this medium we're not going to be able to do. But we'll look forward to when we can. So